Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabian News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, Donald Trump blames Democrat rhetoric for whipping up hatred against him and, quote, causing him to be shot at as the FBI continues its investigation into Sunday's second attempt on the former president's life. With the cost of everything and worries of a recession weighing heavy on the minds of American voters, the US central bank's deciding whether to lower rates. We'll get into why that matters. And staying with economics, speaking to the man many associate with radical proposals pushed forward too fast. Former UK Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng joins me for a chat. Welcome to the show. Now, Donald Trump's claimed rhetoric from Democrats, particularly Vice President Kamala Harris, is responsible for a second assassination attempt against him. The former president making those comments in a post on social media, attributing recent threats to the, quote, communist left rhetoric, arguing their words have taken political hostility to new levels.
There's a lot of rhetoric going on. Right. A lot of people think that the Democrats, when they talk about threat to democracy and all of this. Mm-hmm. And it seems that both of these people were radical lefts. The first one, they should learn more about. They have apps that they haven't opened yet, which is pretty strange. And the father went out and got the biggest lawyer in the state of Pennsylvania, which is pretty strange, about the father of the shooter. We're talking about in Butler, the first one. And that's pretty strange. There are a couple of pretty strange things going on there.
Well, for more on the latest details, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by our correspondent there, Caroline Malone. Caroline, great to see you. Look, Trump, as we were hearing there, making those statements about Democrat rhetoric in a social media video. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, he absolutely has been doing that, as has his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance. We were hearing Trump in social media, and he's been speaking in different forums over the last few days, one of which was a live stream that was on Monday night, in which it was a pre-planned event. He was talking about a new cryptocurrency business that he's releasing with his family. And he took the opportunity to criticize Harris and Biden and blame them in part for what he calls this rhetoric that's leading to political tension. He also, though, went into more detail about the experience of what happened to him when he was on the golf course, talking about how excellent the Secret Service were, how quickly they acted, and that he was with a friend. And he said as soon as the Secret Service agent with him heard the first gunshot, they protected him, and he really applauded that. He also talked about the witness, who was the person who actually saw the suspect fleeing from the scene, took a photo and found the also the car license plate, which then they gave to security officials. And that led to the eventual arrest of the suspect, as we now know. So really, we've been hearing some praise from Trump for the Secret Service, also some blame for the rhetoric. He also, though, spoke about how President Biden had called him and they'd had a phone call. He described it as very pleasant. The White House said the same. It was very cordial. He said Biden couldn't have been any nicer, but he also said he expressed to Biden that he feels he needs better protection from the Secret Service. And that is certainly something we've also heard from President Biden on Monday, who suggested they need more resources.
Have we heard anything else from the Democrat camp, from the Democrat side of things? I mean, Trump's language, as you've talked there, it's been pretty strong, blaming them for their rhetoric and saying they're pretty much the enemy from within, but then seemingly having a very pleasant phone call with Biden thereafter. So have there been any other comments from the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, it is very contradictory in a lot of ways, isn't it? We've certainly heard initially after this second attempted assassination of Trump from both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, who've condemned any form of political violence. They've been very strong on that statement and also calling and applauding the Secret Service for their action and calling for more support for the Secret Service. But on both sides of the aisle, there has been strong rhetoric. This is a very tense election campaign. We're in the final 6-7 weeks. Both sides have been strongly criticizing each other. The frame of the line that the Democrats have been using more often than not is that Trump is a threat to democracy. Certainly, I guess it's open to interpretation if that does incite violence. And potentially, once we know more about the suspect, he'll be back in court next week and then in 2 weeks' time for an arraignment. Once we know more about his motivation, perhaps there'll be more understanding of what actually led him to decide to go to that golf course and try to, we think, shoot at Trump. So very important to find out more of this detail here. There is also, though, separately, a bipartisan task force in Congress. That is a group of both Democrats and Republicans who've met and who have been meeting since the first assassination attempt on Trump, since the Butler, Pennsylvania rally. And they are trying to look through the security detail, trying to review what happened, trying to get to the source of these problems. They've also said they, of course, will be looking at what happened on Sunday to Trump in this second attempt. So there is a group of bipartisan lawmakers as well who are willing to come together, putting politics aside, to try and do the right thing and ultimately make sure that these political candidates are protected.
Now, of course, this story has taken up much of the attention, much of the focus around this election race over the last 48 hours or so. But surely the candidates and the parties are up to other things as well, with only 49 days or 48 days to go until the election. What is on their agenda at the moment?
So Kamala Harris is actually in Philadelphia today. She's attending an event with Black journalists. That is a key demographic, voter demographic for her. And of course, being in Philadelphia, that's in the state of Pennsylvania, a key swing state. So she's taking another opportunity to reach out to voters in a swing state that are ultimately going to be deciding who wins this election. Recent polls, particularly over the last 24 hours, have shown that, as we thought, Kamala Harris did very well in the debate against Trump. And that has actually boosted the numbers nationwide, something like up to 6% ahead of Trump in some polling nationwide. But it really comes down to the swing states. It's all about who decides to vote for either Harris or Trump in these swing states. So Harris in a swing state on Tuesday. We're also going to see President Biden in the same swing state later in the week. We've got J.D. Vance, who's campaigning in Michigan, another key area where there's a battleground state there, trying to gain as many voters as possible. And that, I think, is how we're going to see the rest of this campaign play out over the next few weeks. Because ultimately, if they can win, either candidate can win 3 or 4 of the swing states, that really puts them in position to end up back or into the White House.
And Caroline, just finally, elsewhere in the show, we're talking about the economic impact of inflation and sky-high costs of living on this election. The Fed having a meeting could cut interest rates. Will this have any impact on the race?
Well, the economy is a huge deal for voters here in the United States, particularly inflation and the cost of living. That has been top of mind for many voters over the last few years. And it's certainly a campaign issue that Republicans in particular have campaigned on. They've spoken and criticized the Biden administration and, of course, by extension, Vice President Harris, because they see their economic policies as making the situation worse for people in the United States. So with this Fed meeting, we are likely to hear about interest rates cuts. The question is, how far will those interest rate cuts go? But off the back of it, the implication is that inflation is coming down, which is leading the Federal Reserve to decide that they are in the right place to do the rate cuts. And that is another campaign item that Biden and Harris could potentially use to their advantage, because they can express how the economy is recovering and how it continues to recover, particularly post-pandemic, but in a way that is sustainable, in a way that hasn't led to any form of recession, but also crucially bringing that cost of living right back down for people.
Caroline Malone speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you. Well, Well, for reaction to this, I'm joined now by the chair of the Republican Party in Texas, Abraham George. Sir, thank you for making time. And let's get straight to it. Another, quite frankly, terrifying event in the lead up to this election race. On Sunday, with another apparent attempt on Donald Trump, this time at his golf course. Now, since then, Donald Trump actually talking in a Fox News interview in the last 24 hours or so, blaming the Democrat Party's rhetoric, specifically Harris and Biden, for causing him to be shot at. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, Democrat Party and their leaders, Hillary Clinton including, have been pushing this narrative that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy for the past many years. Now, if you tell someone, this is the guy who's going to destroy America so many times in so many ways and for so many years, people will feel like, okay, they're going to have to take care of this. And that's what's happening. The rhetoric is causing a huge divide in the United States. And, end result is things like this. There's enough crazy people out there who will do something stupid like this. So that's absolutely, the entire country agrees with this now.
Picking up on that word they used, destroy, because within that very same interview, Donald Trump accusing the Democrats of wanting to, quote, destroy the country, calling them the enemy within and saying they are the real threat. Could that also be classed as dangerous rhetoric?
It is. I mean, when we have leaders from Democratic Party calling one group of people neo-Nazis and white supremacists and nationalists, it can be, and it goes for all of us, right? I mean, you don't go into, but if it is factual based, Democratic Party currently have no base in calling anything about Democratic because their presidential candidate is not elected not even by a single Democrat. Joe Biden was their candidate. It was on the ballot. 16 million people voted for Joe Biden. I think 14 million people voted for Joe Biden. There was not another choice in that ballot. There's a few others who didn't really make it, but Kamala Harris was not on that ballot. It was basically a coronation of Kamala Harris. That's what took place at the DNC convention. So Democrat Party cannot claim to have any democratic process in their own party anymore. That ship has sailed. So the rhetoric in politics have gotten way too much into the danger zone these days, and this is creating all kinds of problems in our country.
I mean, when we talk about, let's talk about a bit more about that rhetoric, because you mentioned there those words like white nationalist, supremacist, right-wing, far right-wing, in other countries as well, those on the right side of politics, by which I mean the right-hand side, often make the same complaints. They don't want to be called far right or extremist or fascist, but at the same time, we hear the terms communist, socialist, far left, those types of things used in reverse attack almost. Do you think that's sort of adding to this sort of atmosphere of hostility?
Not really. Communist is not a, we don't call someone communist by looking at their color. We don't call someone communist by looking at their background. We call communist based on policy. That is a policy position. White supremacist is not a policy position. People have called me white supremacist because I'm part of the Republican Party here in the United States. And they haven't seen me, so they just make that assumption just because I support the Republican Party, I'm a white supremacist. That is a danger. When you have a communist ideology, of socialist ideology, of Marxist ideology coming from a leader, then calling them that, it's not a bad thing. Call a spade a spade. So it's very simple.
How do you feel being called a white supremacist?
Well, I laugh at it because it's an interesting twist. And then one time a major newspaper wrote that about me, and I sent them a picture of me standing at the RNC. And, they sent me a apology text saying, sorry, we did not know you were a person of color. That was basically what they said. And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm an American. That's all matters to me. And that's what's supposed to matter when it comes to journalism, not the color of the people.
Really interesting. Thanks for answering me on that. It was just interesting picking up on what you said there. In terms of social media, let's talk about the effect that that's having on all this sort of hostility, this venomous political debate, because Elon Musk, you know, the world's richest man, owner of platform X, arguably the most important political debate platform out there, he had to apologize on Monday for actually tweeting about an observation about the fact that there's been no assassination attempts against Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. And do you think that kind of thing is unhelpful at the moment, or do you think it's just a harmless joke?
Well, I don't know what Elon does, honestly, but be honest with you, calling for someone's assassination, regardless of whose party you were in, and I'm glad he apologized, that's not the right thing for our country. What we need to work on is the policy differences, because in the United States, as you know, inflation is so high, people are having a hard time going to grocery store, affording regular things like bread and butter and milk. We got to work on those things. We've got to work on gas prices. We are in a place where our inflation is so high that people are having a hard time going to work and coming back. So people an average American wanted to hear about things like that, but not necessarily, I mean, nobody wants to hear about a leader, regardless of which side of the spectrum you are, calling for assassination of their opposite party or ideology. That is just not helpful or not good for the United States at this point. Honestly, not good in any country. So why would we do that here in the US?
I'm glad you brought up the economy, because we're doing a special focus on that in our show tonight. And we're going to be speaking to a former trade representative about that. But in terms of people potentially getting distracted then from the main policy points, which is what you sort of seem to be suggesting here, is that, you know, the average needs of the average American voter aren't being looked out for. It's just a lot of politics and slang and name calling and things like that. How do we lower the tone, do you think, on those exchanges and get the parties to focus on what matters?
Well, the Republican Party is focused on that. I mean, what a lot of people see in the mainstream media is just the sound bites. And honestly, I blame the media for that, because media's job is to go into the policy and dig deeper and say, okay, where does this party and where does this candidate stand on policies? You know, look at when President Trump was in the office. 4 years was one of the best 4 years of the United States. And look at when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris was in office, it was one of the worst 4 years of the United States. So it's very simple to look at policies in such a way, but media wouldn't do that. I mean, I'm not blaming you, but most media, mainstream media, would rather talk about small thing that doesn't really matter to an average American. That needs to focus back to going back, and media needs to do their job on that, along with the parties focusing on things like, you know, economy, border, inflation, things like that, instead of talking about, you know, random things and name calling. And I think the adults in the room have to be better than that. Unfortunately, today, it's not the case, because that's what's selling. And unfortunately, the parties and candidates are moving in that direction. So we got to come back into policies and positions where it helps or hurts helps or hurts the American people, and look at it and see what are our solutions.
Do you think there are adults in the room, there in the White House and Capitol Hill, that are actually getting these policies dealt with, and that what we're seeing, what is being portrayed in the media, what we're seeing from the candidates, is just a sort of front-facing theatre?
It is. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, again, for media, it's sound bites, because you guys got to work on your rating. And for the party, we are always worried about our candidates and their polling. Everyone is somewhat selfish in a lot of areas. And that's why, as a leader in the Republican Party, I really want to talk about policies. What does it mean to have President Trump back in White House versus Kamala Harris back in White House? If that happens, we will have an economy that is failing, and probably at a brink where we will have World War III, because we have so much going on all over the world. We got to talk about all of those specific issues, which is what we are focused on. All of our ads going out these days are not really talking about all these tiny sound bites. We're talking about policies and our platform. Where do we stand on open border? Where do we stand on gender modification of our children? Where do we stand on a school choice? There are so many things that are happening in the United States that needs to be talked about in the public square. So that's what we're focused on. We're not doing the name calling. We're not doing any of those stuff. At least not in the Republican Party of Texas.
I was going to talk to you about that. You're chair of the Republican Party of Texas. Talk to us about, I mean, it sounds like you've got a very clear mandate of what you want to achieve in your role, but what is it like there? What are the Republican members saying to you? What are they looking to hear from in this election?
Well, they're looking for two things. One, we've got to win the election. So that's the main thing. It's just not the federal. We have our state election going on where a lot of our state representatives are up for re-election. Many of our senators are up for re-election. Many statewide are up for re-election. So we're working on all of those. Ted Cruz, our senator, U.S. senator, is up for re-election. So all of those matters because not only policies in D.C. matters, and also in Austin matters to us. So we're working on all of those. That's one major mandate for me until November 5th. The other is Republican Party state of Texas have created priorities. We have 8 priorities that we set together. Then we have the platform, which includes things like open border. We got to close our border. Talking about our power grid. Talking about banning taxpayer-funded lobbying, things like that. So there's so much going on, and that's what we're focused on. And they want me to, my job, the mandate is very clear, get the conservative priorities passed at the legislative session. So that's what I'm working on.
How safe do you feel in your role there, in your role as chair of the Republican Party in Texas? Because election officials, for example, there's reports of them receiving suspicious packages today. I understand they've got a completely different role in the political system to you, but is it increasingly becoming more dangerous to be in politics in America?
Yeah, both sides are worried about it, to be honest with you. I get worried about some of the times just because I travel all over the state of Texas. A lot of times it's just by myself. So a lot of times I have my staffers with me. But when we do, people are crazy. It doesn't take a lot for someone to attack you, do things like that. But, I'm secure and safe. I have people around me who will protect me. And I'm a believer in Christ, and I leave it up to him.
And I'm assuming a believer in gun rights as well, given that you're in Texas and you are a Republican.
I do, and I do carry my weapon with me, yes.
Interesting stuff. Look, in terms of Trump's protection, let's talk a little bit about that, because it's been a big topic of discussion. In fact, he had a phone call with President Biden today, and Trump actually saying he was terribly nice to him, Biden. He said, I really appreciated the call almost. He couldn't have been nicer, were Trump's words about Biden. So maybe potentially walking back on calling him the enemy within. But talking about beefing up Trump's security detail, Trump saying he needs, a lot more. He's got 50,000, 60,000 people showing up to events. Those are Trump's own words. Biden potentially promising more security. Do you think Trump will get that security?
I don't think he will, but mainly because the Democrat Party will not allow Biden to do that. Joe Biden, recently Trump said Joe Biden hates Kamala Harris more than he hates me. And during the debate, and I believe that. And I think the American people believe that because Joe Biden, everybody knows here, that was pushed out of the office, and he hated that. I mean, he was consistently going out and saying, "Hey, I'm running for re-election," but the Democrat Party did not allow him to do that. So it's the same thing. I don't think Joe Biden is in charge of our country. So are they going to allow him to make a decision that Trump will be protected? Probably not. I think the Republican Party is looking, and Trump's team is looking to hire private security for him now.
Yeah, I was certainly thinking private security might be sensible at this point. And in terms of what he's doing, I know you're not privy to Trump's personal diary or anything else. You don't know what's going on in his mind or his day. However, we do know he loves to play golf. This attempted attack happened on his golf course on Sunday, or within the boundaries of it. And there has been analysis that he should stop playing golf as much. Plenty of presidents have played golf, but apparently it's the frequency and ease with which Trump just walks out onto one of his golf courses that causes for concern. Do you think he should stop playing golf?
Oh, I hope not. I don't think walking away, hiding, that's not the Republican way. That's not the American way. We forced through things like this. We've gone through much worse situations in our country before, and I really hope that he is out there doing rallies and working the crowd and playing golf and whatever he loves to do. That should be a fundamental right of any citizen, let alone a former president and a candidate for the president for this term. So, yeah, I hope he will not back down on this.
In terms of what's left to go in this race to the White House, some 48 days left. We've already seen so much. I know everyone always says the American presidential election is always full of twists and turns and drama, but 2 potential assassination attempts on one of the candidates. What else could we see?
We don't know. There's a saying in U.S. it's October surprise, and we're not even in October yet. So I don't know what else is there. We are hoping to have a peaceful election and have a peaceful transition from the Biden-Harris to President Trump and J.D. Vance, but we don't know. People are crazy. We have no idea what's coming. So we're prepared for everything. We're looking for ways to protect our candidates and our elected officials and, work the crowd and talk to people and be available to American people.
Do you think it's right that there should be stepped up security, certainly on January 6th, if there is that need for a transition of power on that day?
I doubt it. I don't think when Republicans go somewhere, we don't burn down cities. That's not a thing. For Democrats to do something like that, they have, their history behind this in the last 6-8 years. They've burned down cities, police stations, police cars. So we're hoping that's not the case this time. And American people are tired of it. They're not expecting that. They don't want that. And that is one of the reasons they're losing. The Democrats are losing because of what they did in the past. And Tim Walz, the candidate for vice president, is actually a guy who actually supported this kind of things in Minneapolis. So American people are looking at it and saying, okay, if he did this as a governor, what is he going to do as a vice president? So there's a lot going on, and I hopefully there are no more violence in D.C. or anywhere else.
I mean, when I'm talking about January 6th, of course, I'm not talking about Minneapolis or violence in other cities that may have been caused by left-leaning voters. I'm, of course, talking about the insurrection attempts on January the 6th a couple of years ago, and that was by Donald Trump supporters. So then, do you think it's necessary to have stepped up security, given that this regards President Trump again?
Well, if you look at January 6th incident, you can clearly see there was some violence in one part of the Capitol, but that's not what is being pushed in the media. Media pushes into an insurrection. There was nobody walked into the Capitol with a weapon. Nobody burned down any things. People were escorted into the Capitol by the Capitol Police, and now they're facing 3, 5, 10 years of prison sentence to going into the Capitol that they own. It's their Capitol. Obviously these things are a misdemeanor in many cases. Unfortunately, that's not the way the DOJ has weaponized this incident against the Republican Party and the Republicans and the people. So I will never condone violence. If there are some people who got into that, I will not support that. But that is not the narrative the media has pushed. So for you to ask me if there's going to be another insurrection, the answer is there wasn't one last time either. There was violence and there was enough people. Nancy Pelosi failed to protect the Capitol. That was her job to do, and President Trump actually allowed and told her that she can have the National Guard. She didn't do it. So, and there's a lot more coming out, and there's an investigation committee at the U.S. House. They're looking into it. So we're still waiting to see the rest of the results on that. So I don't think there's going to be another insurrection because there wasn't one in the first place.
Just talk to me a little bit about the media, because you've mentioned quite a lot. You feel obviously there's a lot of bias in the US media, in the mainstream media, about the way that the candidates are being approached and historical issues are being approached in this election. Do you feel like there are more alternatives these days to what you call the mainstream media? For example, X or other right-leaning news platforms where you're able to get your voice heard?
I think the mainstream media, if they don't come back to actually reporting the truth and just staying out of the opinion part of the thing, especially in the United States. I think they're going to go out of business very soon because people like Elon Musk, who is pushing X, and I don't call Elon Musk a right-leaning guy. He was a Democrat, and he basically said the party and the ideology left me. I didn't leave the Democrat Party. There are other social media platforms out there, even the right-leaning or left-leaning social media platforms are, when Zuckerberg came out and said, yes, I censored conservatives during the last election cycle. So it's not a secret to say, okay, this is happening. MSNBC and CBS and ABC and all of those guys, CNN especially, just go out and spread the propaganda against Republicans, not necessarily right-leaning Republicans, for all Republicans. Look at the last debate. Not a single question about his assassination, not even once. Trump had to bring that up one time. The ABC debate team did not think that this is going to be a thing that people wanted to hear. So they didn't care about it. They didn't want to talk about it. They fact-checked him 7 times, I believe, and not even a single time for Kamala Harris. So it is a biased media. And obviously, people are going into non-traditional media these days because of that.
Certainly they are. Look, it's been a really interesting discussion. We appreciate your time. Chair of the Republican Party in Texas, Abraham George. While the candidates and their parties continue to battle for the White House, many voters are most worried about the state of their finances at home and what's being done to help. We'll speak more about that after this break.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Well, with a cost of living crisis and worries of a recession weighing heavy on the minds of American voters, the suits at the US Central Bank are sitting down over the next few days to decide whether to lower interest rates. The Fed, as it's known, expected to join other central banks around the world in starting its own rate-cutting cycle. But what impact will that actually have? For more on this, I'm joined by former acting United States Trade Representative and former General Counsel to the US Trade Representative under former President Donald Trump, Stephen Vaughn. Sir, great to have you with us today. And I appreciate you're not a financial analyst. This isn't business television, nor are you speaking on behalf of any kind of bank or economics institute. But let's just get the obvious question out of the way. How much do you think the Fed is going to cut rates by?
Well, I mean, as you said, this is, it's a very open question, and I don't want to really opine on it. But I think most people in Washington seem to be anticipating a rate cut of either 25 to 50 basis points. And I think that's going to be what people are really looking for tomorrow.
Yeah, and that 50 basis points at half a percentage cut is quite aggressive in terms of Fed movements, normally just a quarter of a percentage move downwards. But clearly there are signals that there is sort of a cooling inflation within the US economy. However, a weak labour market as well. So some very difficult economic factors at play for them to contend with. Talk to me about how much difference it will make. Let's think about the average voter here, the people worried about their mortgages and their grocery baskets. How much of a difference could it make if the Fed actually lowers that interest rate?
So, I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on how long it takes to go through the system. So, for example, today, obviously, you're seeing some activity in the stock market, which at least a lot of the commentators believe relates to people anticipating what the Fed may do tomorrow. So some people may look at that and see that as a favorable sign for the economy. Other things, as you know, obviously when you change the interest rates, it takes longer to work through the economy. Normally, They're hesitant to make changes to the rates this close to the election. But in any event, it's not really clear at this point that you would see a significant change in the economic situation before the election.
Talk to us about the economic situation for the, I know it's a difficult term, the quote unquote average American right now, but you have your sense of the kind of the nuclear family, maybe in a suburban home, a car, doing their average weekly shop. What are things like for them at the moment?
So basically, they came out with new data yesterday showing last week showing what's happened to real median household incomes in the United States. And we see that those peaked in 2019. We had a drop off in 2020, 2021, and 2022. It started to rebound last year in 23, but it was still below the peak in 2019. So that's pretty consistent with what we've been seeing in a lot of the polling, which is that a lot of people still are pretty pessimistic about the economy. They don't really feel like things have come all the way back since the pandemic. And the real median household income totally backs that up.
In terms of coming back from the pandemic, the labour market, the US labour market being one of those key indicators and actually getting quite soft, what's called jobs reports that measure the state of labour in the US economy over the last 2 months. Not as many jobs coming up as available. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, obviously, one of the things that happened, at least the way most people here think about it, is they did have inflation a few years ago. It was the highest inflation we'd had in quite a while. In response, there was a fairly aggressive, rise in interest rates. And as a result of that, you're now seeing the sort of slowing and softening of the economy, which, of course, is what the interest rate increases were designed to do. The question on the table today is, has inflation really been brought under control such that now it will be appropriate to lower interest rates and sort of re-stimulate the economy and get things going again? And that's what the Fed is going to tell us tomorrow.
Inevitably, whenever we approach these Fed meetings or any kind of central bank meeting, whether it be in Europe or the UK or Asian economies as well, there's always conversation about how effective the central bank is in controlling inflation using interest rate reductions. What is the general sense, or maybe potentially what's your sense of the efficacy of the Fed these days? Do you have faith in it?
Well, I think certainly the evidence suggests that the interest rates, they did raise the interest rates, the inflation did go down. Most of the recent reports have indicated that inflation has been reduced. Now, their target traditionally is at 2%. I'm not sure it's gotten all the way down to 2% yet. Different measures show different things. But certainly, I think, I think they're going to say tomorrow they think that it had the intended effect, and that having had the intended effect, they don't want the economy to slow down too much. And I think that's why we'll probably see a cut tomorrow.
What about the narrative around Jerome Powell, or Jay Powell as he's often known, the Fed chair? Is there faith in what he's doing, the decisions he's making?
Well, I think it sort of depends on who you talk to, right? In other words, obviously, for the most part, the voters are still pretty frustrated with the state of the economy. The inflation still weighs on a lot of people. Wages, for the most part, over the last 3 or 4 years have not kept pace with inflation. And that's obviously been a big issue in this election. How much of that, the Fed bears responsibility for, I think it's sort of difficult to sort that out.
What do you think will be Jerome Powell's legacy?
I think a lot of it depends on what happens over the next, few years. In other words, I think if he is seen as someone who is able to steer the Americans through this and get, the so-called soft landing, in other words, bring the inflation down without having a significant effect of job losses, I think that's what he'll mostly be remembered for. If he turns out that, for example, if he cuts the interest rates and inflation shoots back up, then he may, then that'll sort of have more of an impact on how he's remembered. So I really think it's too early to say. I think we have to kind of wait and see how this plays out over the next couple of years.
Let's think now about the election, of course, coming right into vision currently with a lot going on. And whenever I'm interviewing people from the US, from your country, I'm hearing a lot of people saying the media are getting distracted by the headline-grabbing stuff. Obviously, assassination attempts are worthy of headlines, but certainly all the kind of rhetoric that's being bandied back and forth. And what we should really be focusing on is the economy, because voters are going to vote on the economy. Do you agree with that?
I think obviously the voters have been saying for a couple of years now that the economy is the most important issue. Inflation is another one that's always listed as a very important issue. So, yeah, I think it's impossible to really understand what's happening here politically without understanding some of the concerns that the voters have about the economy.
How much of a difference do you think lowered inflation could actually make in this election? Surely it would be something the Democrats would want to capitalize on if they can in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, the polls have pretty consistently showed that voters prefer President Trump on the economy. I think it's not likely that anything that happens between now and November is going to change that. He has a record. The current administration has a record. And like I said, if you look at the household incomes, we still haven't gotten back to where we were in 2019. So I think the voters are going to take that into account.
Yeah, and obviously, when you speak to any of the Republican or Democrat sides on this, they'll selectively pick and choose. Well, when Trump was in office, this wasn't happening, or when the Democrats were in office, they had to deal with the post effects of COVID, et cetera, et cetera. You're always going to have that argument that when certain candidates were in office, other world factors weren't impacting them in that way. In terms of Trump's record on the economy, do you think the average American voter, when they go to the polling station on voting day, do you think they're really going to be thinking, I felt richer under Trump?
Well, the polls indicate that is what most voters will be thinking. Now, obviously, then the question becomes, is that what they vote on, or do they vote based on other issues? But I think we've had a lot of polling over this issue over the last year, and in general, almost every poll indicates that the voters think he did a better job on the economy.
Now, of course, trade is your specialty, and it would be remiss of us, Mr. Vaughn, to speak to you without talking about trade policy. Donald Trump has historically been quite radical, some would say, on his approach to trade, and this was when you were in the trade part of his administration. Do you still stand by the approach that was taken at that time?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as radical. In other words, I think what he was trying to do was to create incentives and encouragements to have, more U.S. workers and have more jobs created in the U.S. and have more manufacturing in the U.S. And I think the data indicated that he succeeded. But I think the data also indicated, he made trade deals with Canada and Mexico and Japan and Korea and China. So he was very willing to make deals when he thought those were in the interest of the United States.
The US Chamber of Commerce putting out a report post-Trump presidency saying, in terms of seeking new market access abroad for US exports, the Trump administration's record was poor. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think that's true. And like I said, we revised the the NAFTA agreement, got a new agreement which passed overwhelmingly in the Congress. We got an agreement with China that would have given us more market access into that country. We got agreement with Japan that would have given American farmers more access into that country. So I think it was a very robust record and a very strong effort.
In terms of tariffs, because he's often known as the tariff man, Donald Trump, amongst other things, he championed tariffs, of course, and this was, again, when you were in that sort of that department at the time, and other limits on imports as a sort of tonic for wider-ranging economic ills. Do you think that's still a policy that's worth exploring and pushing forward?
Well, I think it's interesting that the current administration, pretty much agreed to keep almost all those tariffs in place. They're all still in place to this day. And like I said, if you look at the numbers, whether you look at the income numbers, you look at the jobs numbers, if you look at sort of how the economy did, in 2018, 2019, before COVID hit, I think it's pretty clear that those policies were effective.
So how do you rate the Biden administration's approach to trade over the past few years?
I think for the most part, they stuck pretty close to what we saw during the last administration. They kept a lot of the tariffs in place as they were. And I think that they, haven't really shown a big effort to make a lot of changes there. They haven't talked a whole lot about trade in terms of what they would do in a next administration. So it's early to say in terms of what they would do next.
I was going to ask you that. Do you have a clear sense of what Kamala Harris's trade policy would look like?
She hasn't really said a whole lot in terms of detail, and so she hasn't really put out a lot. And my guess is that I think she would probably stick pretty close to what they've done over the last few years. but it's really too early to say.
What do you think a second Trump presidency would look like from a trade perspective?
I think he would, I think he's been pretty clear about he would like to go forward with some additional tariff measures. I think he would be, engaged in, robust negotiations with countries around the world. There's an opportunity to re-engage with Mexico and Canada on some of the issues relating to the USMCA. So I think you would see that. So I think it would be an effort again to use trade policy the same way he did in the first term to encourage more investment in the United States, get more jobs, get more Americans back to work, and help those Americans get higher real wages, after inflation wages, in exchange for their efforts.
I know you've gone back into private practice now, essentially, but if you were back in the Trade Department under Donald Trump, what would you be advising him?
Well, obviously, I think that, that we do need to take a robust approach on trade. I think the United States continues to run, very, very large trade deficits. And I think it's always challenging when you're in that situation to get other countries to engage with you. And so I think that the approach he took before was the correct approach, and I would just hope that he would build on that.
Would you go back if you were invited back into his department?
Well, that's way too, I'm not going to speculate on that.
Okay, fair enough. What do you think a second presidency for Trump would look like otherwise in terms of other policies in the economy, but elsewhere as well? There are concerns that certain conservative manifestos put forward, for example, like Project 2025, which Trump has distanced himself from, might sort of influence the way that his presidency would be run. What do you say to that?
I think he's been very straightforward on all these issues. I think he's indicated that he would stick pretty closely to the priorities and goals that he had in the first administration on domestic policy. I think you would see an effort to encourage economic activity, but also make sure that that activity benefits workers. And we saw he was very successful in that in the first term. I think in terms of foreign policy, he's talked about wanting to be a negotiator and to bring resolutions to some of these conflicts around the world. And when he was president before, we didn't see as many of these conflicts. So I think it would just basically be a continuation of what happened in his first term.
And do you think he's going to do it? Do you think he'll manage to seal the deal?
Oh, of course, I think he has a very good chance. It's a very close election right now. But certainly, I think if the voters go based on what they're saying in terms of the economy, then yes, I think he will win the election.
Stephen Vaughn, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, the Biden administration continues to be dogged by low approval ratings over his handling of the economy, despite the country's finances being in pretty strong health. Some experts believing that a so-called vibecession could be because Americans are still smarting from high interest rates. While Kamala Harris tries to sell the administration's record on the economy as she campaigns for the presidency, her opponent Donald Trump is looking to appeal to those voters who say they don't feel it in their pocket. From Washington, Kate Fisher reports.
The US economy is growing, expanding by 3% last year with low unemployment and fears of a recession fading. But voters don't seem to be buying it. A poll for The Guardian newspaper from earlier this year shows nearly 3 in 5 Americans wrongly believe that the US is in a recession and that the economy is shrinking.
It's just everybody's feeling it. I have 2 kids and it's hard.
Prices are higher than they were a few years ago.
Economists have given a name to this disconnect.
Vibecession is the idea that the economy can be doing quite well, but the vibes, the feelings of the people are not where we think they should be.
Harvard economist Judd Kramer co-wrote a paper earlier this year analyzing why this could be happening.
The measures that we traditionally use to describe whether we're in a recession or an expansion, those are all in great shape. Unemployment is low, inflation is declining, GDP growth has been doing well. We would have expected that given those things, consumer sentiment would also be rising, but we haven't seen that to be the case at all.
That could be partly down to the effect of elevated interest rates, which have raised mortgage and credit card repayments, but which aren't included in measures of inflation. Rates are set by the US central bank and not the president, but they've left many Americans feeling pinched, something Trump is maximising on.
Are you better off now with Harris and Biden than you were with a person named President Donald J. Trump? Under Kamala Harris and crooked Joe Biden, the American dream is dead.
Harris has acknowledged people's concerns.
While our economy is doing well by many measures, prices for everyday things like groceries are still too high. You know it and I know it.
But as the sitting vice president, she will have to distance herself from that if she's to increase her support. With the US central bank not expected to lower interest rates much, if at all, by November's election, and with families still feeling the pinch, the Harris campaign may struggle to convince Americans that her party's handling of the economy is worth their vote. Kate Fisher, Al Arabiya English, Washington.
Economies around the world are grappling with a mix of challenges and uncertainties. Rising inflation, disrupted supply chains, and the ongoing impact of geopolitical tensions have created a volatile environment for countries around the world. From energy shortages to soaring food prices, economies both large and small are feeling the pressure, with governments and central banks navigating difficult choices to stabilise growth and curb a cost of living crisis. Amid this turbulent economic landscape, former British Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng remains an outspoken voice. In his brief tenure in the famously brief premiership of Liz Truss in the UK, he put forward radical ideas to try to stimulate economic growth. Now, this included slashing tax, freezing energy bills, and scrapping the limit on bankers' bonuses. These proposals causing the pound to fall to its lowest ever level against the US dollar and sparking turmoil in the bond markets and chaos in the mortgage markets. Kwasi Kwarteng has since defended that approach, but he has spoken also about warning Liz Truss that she was going too fast with her plans. As the world continues to adapt to rapid economic shifts, Kwarteng's time as Chancellor offers a striking example of the complex decisions faced by policymakers today, and I spoke to him about exactly that. I am now joined by the former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng. So thank you for your time. And I hope you don't mind me starting like this, but I've noticed that you've done a lot of media interviews recently in the last few weeks. It's been 2 years, almost exactly, since your time as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the short-lived premiership of Liz Truss. Is there a reason that you're kind of doing lots of media now?
Well, I've been around. I've left Parliament. I left Parliament at the general election. And there's plenty going on, and people like yourself want to hear commentary, they want to hear views, and I'm very happy to engage in those conversations. And I think people, when they listen to what I have to want to say, you know, there's an interest in that.
Yeah, there certainly are, and that's why we invited you on to talk to you, because you do have a lot to offer in terms of your vast experience, your economic knowledge, your knowledge of global affairs as well, and we will get on to that. But why it interests me that you're doing so much media now is because, of course, you end up inevitably facing the same questions again and again about your time as Chancellor of the Exchequer. What happened to the economy at the time? Some say it, you know, called it the collapse or the tanking of the economy. Some refer to as the man who screwed up the British economy. I mean, what's that like, hearing that again and again?
Well, you know, the more I hear it, the less sort of powerful it is, because clearly that was 2 years ago. And I think the Labour Party, our opposition, made a lot of hay with it. But actually, the fundamental problems we were trying to solve are still there. There's still an issue of growth. There's a real concern in the UK that at the next budget there'll be tax increases. The government are heralding that. And of course, we tried to do the opposite. I think it was rushed. Looking back, I think we made mistakes. But the fundamental issues are still there. And I'm very interested in that debate. And as time goes on, I think the issue of growth within the British economy, and not only the British economy, across Europe, will become more pressing and a more fitting subject of debate.
And I find that interesting because I have heard you defending obviously your strategy, but again, saying it was rushed at the time. So if you had a chance at doing it again, would you again go for that sort of drastic action, but in a different way? Was it being accompanied with Prime Minister Liz Truss?
I think it was too rushed. I've said this.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I've said it repeatedly. I think, you know, the ship of state, to use that metaphor, is an oil tanker. It's not a speedboat. You can't move things very, very fast. I think the Prime Minister's view was that we had to seize the day in that expression. But looking back, I think we should have taken a slightly more measured approach. You know, we can debate this endlessly. Hindsight is a beautiful thing, and history is very interesting. But what interests me now more is the future, is what is the UK going to do in the years ahead. We can talk about the mini budget, we can talk about the fallout, we can talk about the rising interest rates, we can talk about all of that. That's interesting. But what's more interesting, I think, to your viewers, and certainly to markets, is the future. Will Donald Trump win? What will the nature of the British budget be like? What's going on in France? These are the issues. What's going on in Ukraine and the Middle East? These are the issues that I think people are very focused on. And of course, I'd be very happy to talk to you about the mini budget and what happened 2 years ago.
Well,
but I think that's of less salience today than some of the other issues.
And I agree with you. I'm very much in mind of looking at the present and the future, what the current government in the UK is doing, how everything else affects that. But that's why I began the conversation in this way, because I'm interested in you putting yourself out there now. Sure. As you say, you've left Parliament and now you're doing a lot of media interviews, and you're inevitably going to come up against that questioning of what happened 2 years ago. So let's enjoy.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer it. Happy to answer it, but I'm just saying that, you know, there's that, and also there's the present and the future, and I think people are more interested in the present and the future.
Let's then think about the present and future. Start with the UK, but we will broaden out. But talking about what's happening there, of course, the Labour government that is currently in power, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, his Chancellor, will say that they inherited a stagnant economy from the Conservatives, and now they're burdened with it, and they won't be able to achieve the growth that they want. Do you buy that as an argument for what they're trying to do?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I left office in October 2022. Rishi Sunak came in with Jeremy Hunt. They stabilised the markets, and I think they deserve credit for that. And then, of course, this year, we're looking at figures for the UK economy, which are some of the fastest growth rates in the G7. So it's not true to say, as Labour have done, that the economy that they've inherited is a scene of wreckage. I think that's they do that for political purposes, but they also have said that there's a black hole. I think they came in and said there's a 22 billion black hole. But if you have a black hole, you don't then turn around and give the unions a 20% pay rise over 3 years. That seems totally illogical. To say, well, we don't have the money, we've got a deficit to plug, but we're actually going to increase public sector wages far above the rate of inflation. That doesn't make any sense. So clearly, I think they're playing politics. And in order to pay for those wage increases, they've decided to take what's called the winter fuel payment. That's an annual payment of about £300 to every pensioner. And Rachel Reeves, in a bold move, I would suggest, has said she's going to remove that. So these are political decisions. And if you were in the pressure that they say they are, I don't think they would have rushed to do the pay deal that they did.
I mean, they are political decisions, and they are those of the Labour Party, which of course isn't your party, so you're going to naturally probably take an opposite view on them. But in terms of the Conservatives and being the party of the economy, which they have been considered to be for many previous years and previous decades, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, he was called the tax rise Chancellor because he just kept raising taxes. Now, you had a completely different approach to that. Was the fact that the Conservatives lost the election over summer because they didn't have a cohesive strategy when it came to economy? It seemed incredibly divided all over the shop.
Look, I think you're right. I think there were lots of reasons. There were lots of reasons that ended Tory rule. We were in power for 14 years. There was a feeling we'd really run out of ideas. We'd had 5 prime ministers, which was an extraordinary number, and we seemed tired and out of breath, as it were. We were people who the people felt they'd had enough of. They were sick of it. I think at the core of this, these difficulties, has been the COVID pandemic. Because what happened over COVID was the British government, pumped in hundreds of billions. I'm not talking about tens of billions, hundreds of billions to support the economy. And as a consequence of that expenditure, there were really strong reasons to raise the taxes. And the taxes have kept rising since then. And when the Tories had the leadership contest in 2022, this was at the centre of the contest. Liz Truss said she was going to cut taxes, and Rishi Sunak essentially said he was going to keep raising taxes. Liz Truss won the contest. I was Chancellor, she was the Prime Minister. And then what we tried to do, and this is the relevance of our opening remarks, was that we tried to reduce the tax burden because it's at a 70-year high. Now, looking back, I think we tried to do too much too quickly. And crucially, there were two things that we got wrong. One was that we didn't get the OBR to score what we were doing. And secondly, what we should have done is had a very tight spending schedule at the same time as the tax cuts. But we chose not to do that. That was a wrong decision in my view. And as a consequence of the market disruption, she was removed and Rishi Sunak came in. Now, what Rishi Sunak did was simply continue the path we were on. And Labour essentially are doing the same thing. They're raising taxes because they have to pay for increased public expenditure. And the growth isn't at the level that all of us want to see. And if you get slow growth, and this is the doom loop that Liz Truss described, and Labour have also alluded to this, if you don't get growth, the only way you can pay for rising public expenditure is through borrowing, which is future taxation, really delayed, or through direct taxation. And that's why the UK today is facing increased taxes in the next budget, which I think will take place at the end of October.
Look, let's indeed move on. You mentioned Liz Truss there. I know you've made it very clear in previous interviews in recent weeks, so you're not here to throw her under the bus. I've heard you kind of dance around questions where people are asking you whether you're distancing yourself from her. But I want to ask you this then. She's promoting herself quite heavily in America. We've seen her going stateside, speaking to quite controversial characters, Steve Bannon, etc. Why do you think she's doing that? Do you think that's an interesting move?
Well, look, I think she feels very strongly about the message and the style of government that she wanted to see. I think there are many people in America who are instinctively and temperamentally very aligned with a low tax agenda, which I agree with. It's very ideological. And I think she wants to reach out to find kindred spirits across the Atlantic. And I'm sure there are many people, she has many friends in that country. And that's up to her. I mean, she's left the House of Commons, she lost her seat, and now she's making her own way, figuring out what post-parliamentary life looks like.
Will America pull you in, post-parliamentary life?
Well, I've been there a couple of times. It's a nice thing to be out of Parliament, to have the freedom to travel. I'll probably be in the Gulf. I have been to the Gulf a couple of times this year already. And I look forward to travelling there. And of course, for people like yourselves, like your audience, who are interested in global politics, the economy, geopolitics, finance, all those subjects, America is a vitally important country, a great power that has a huge role to play in that world.
What interests me particularly is we're both, you can tell from my accent, we're both Brits. I'm not currently in London, you are. We can see the lovely Tower Bridge behind you there in the studio that you're currently in. But do you think, Mr. Kwarteng, that Britain still has any kind of important standing in the world? Do you think we have a voice? Do you think we have influence?
Yeah, I think we're very good in Britain, probably the best in the world, at doing ourselves down. We're very prone and very quick to criticise what we do in Britain. And it's a part of the British bashfulness, British reserve. We don't really celebrate our achievements in the way that some other countries do. But if you look at Britain today, we're a member of the G7. We're a key player in NATO. We have a seat on the Security Council. We've got the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. And there are lots of things. We've got the English language. We've got the common law. We've got a great time zone for historic reasons, but it is... So there are lots and lots of things about Britain that are very, very positive. And we're very remiss sometimes as politicians and journalists and commentators. We don't celebrate those things enough. And I'm not at all despondent or concerned about the long-term future of the UK. But I do have issues, as you would expect, with higher tax rates and a less competitive economy in the short term. I am concerned about that.
The reason I ask about Britain's standing in the world is whether or not you think there could be any type of special relationship. Obviously, there has been for years and years, but do you think it will become more special or less special if we say, for example, see Harris in the White House or return of Trump?
I think the British government is committed to working with whoever wins. It was a mistake in 2016. I think the assumption in the government and within the Foreign Office was that Hillary Clinton would win. And I think there was a feeling that somehow we'd overlooked the Republicans in the shape of Donald Trump. I think we've covered that, we've recovered that ground. I think that David Lammy will work with whoever gets into the White House, as will Keir Starmer. And I think it's a positive relationship. You look at NATO, for example. Britain is probably, arguably, the key ally in that organization of the United States. We've committed to 2% of our GDP to defense. More than that, 2.5%. 2% is the actual NATO number, but a lot of the other partners haven't committed to that. There are whole other areas as well. If you look at what happened in Afghanistan, if you looked at our cooperation across the global politics, the US-UK relationship is very close. And I think that will be maintained whoever wins in November.
And look, you're post-parliamentary now, you said it yourself, so I can hold you to this. Who do you want to win?
I think that it's a very difficult one. I mean, clearly Trump has got a very difficult personality for many people. He's very bombastic, he's outlandish. But I think generally, for me, his economic agenda is more attractive than Kamala Harris, who is essentially, as far as I can make out, although she's keeping very quiet about this, a very strong left-leaning, socialistic, if you like, person whose approach to the economy will reflect that. I think she mentioned price controls in a speech earlier a few days ago. And that sort of language is very scary. We want an open economy. We want competitive markets. We want lower deregulation, and we also want lower taxes. That, over time, will create much more prosperity. And I think Trump marginally, well, actually by quite a bit, is more attractive on that.
Just finally, on those points of low regulation, low taxes, is there anywhere internationally that excites you economically when you think about that? We've heard Truss in the past describing wanting to create Singapore upon Thames, London or the UK. Whether or not that's possible, some would disagree. Is there an area in the world that you look at and think that's a vibrant, growing economy you'd like to replicate in the UK?
You look at Singapore. Let me just say this. And we get into trouble for saying Singapore and Thames, because in sections of the British media, they think Singapore is just some giant, industrial dystopia, where there are sweatshops and people being exploited and it's a terrible place. Quite the contrary. Singapore, in 1965, which is only less than 60 years ago, was essentially a swamp. I mean, there was nothing there. And in 60 years, through visionary leadership, particularly with Lee Kuan Yew at the helm, they've built a country, a civilization that is extraordinary in terms of wealth, in terms of education, in terms of the opportunities that it gives its people. And that was done not by over-regulation or a very, very high tax burden, but by lower deregulation, allowing the market, allowing people's abilities to find expression, and also through very competitive tax rates. So I think Singapore is completely misunderstood in sections of the West. I think it's an incredible human success story. And when we look back at the 20th century, I think Singapore, the story of Singapore, will be one that will fill people with a lot of hope and admiration.
I find it interesting, the Singapore comparison, because I've worked there for 2 years as a news anchor, so I've lived there. I was there through COVID. I've seen it inside out and back to front, and it's not upon me to have an opinion or to cast any opinion on how it's done. But the critics of that argument is that, yes, whilst it's a success story, it is done in a way that is at odds with the British system of sort of free democracy and, you know, everything that comes with that.
Yeah.
It required a certain form of hard leadership from the top. And what I'm asking is whether you think that would even be possible to replicate somewhere like the UK.
No, so you're quite right. Look, I wasn't talking about Singapore as a political beacon. I was talking about the economic significance of the country, its performance, and also the fact look at where they started. I mean, they didn't have many resources or much in the way of a kind of natural endowment, if you like, in 1965. The story of that country is pretty remarkable, and I would definitely recommend anyone listening and watching to find out more about it. But you're right, the political environment in the UK is very different. We have a pluralistic democracy that's been entrenched for decades now, if not centuries. And the approach is different. But some of the things that they're doing in Singapore, I think, are impressive and should be emulated. All countries have different circumstances. They've got different histories. They sometimes have different forms of government. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from other countries in this very diverse world that we have.
Certainly, I think it pays to look at other models and other styles today. I'm just interested to know about the sort of the real life application of it. Look, you did mention the Middle East previously. We have an interest in covering the area, of course, as all news channels do at the moment, because of the situation there, especially in Gaza. How much do you think this is going to impact the outcome of the US general election?
I think it will quite considerably. I mean, it was very notable to me that at the beginning of the year, President Biden and Harris, the administration, had a much more, to my mind, pro-Israeli policy. And you looked at the primaries. I mean, the Democratic primaries weren't competitive. But in Michigan, there was a huge number of people who didn't vote for Biden. And clearly, I think there was a worry that the high Arab American population in Michigan wasn't going to turn out sufficiently for the Democrats to ensure that they win the state in November. And of course, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, these are three key battleground states that represent the Midwest and the old industrial heartland. So there were political reasons for them, I think, to pivot away from a kind of blanket, blank check approach to supporting Israel. And I think they're much more sensitive to the aspirations of people in the Middle East, the Palestinians, and also Muslim voters, particularly in Michigan. And that's a good thing. It's good that people listen to their electorates, they listen to their constituencies, and they're trying to stitch together a winning coalition, and that's perfectly acceptable. Whether they can pull this off is another question. I think it's a very difficult election to call at the moment. It seems very evenly balanced. But I think in that context, yes, I think what's going on in the Middle East can have an influence on the election, given that the election is so finely balanced. It's so evenly placed at the moment.
And I think the balance is the word there, because the issue of what's happening there in Gaza has created an issue, has been a balance that many Western democratic governments who are going through election cycles have had to deal with on that level. And in talking of which, back in the UK, Starmer's government have decided to limit arms sales to Israel. Did you see that coming? What do you think of that?
I saw it coming. I think it was, to my mind, quite a gesture, more gesture politics, because I think they're stopping 35 weapons, but that's out of about 350, is my understanding. So I don't think it'll make that much difference on the ground. But it is a gesture, I suppose, in this appalling conflict. And the other thing you've got to remember with Labour is that they lost a handful of seats to a party, to a number of independents who were focusing exclusively on this Gaza issue and felt that the Labour opposition was not representing the hopes and aspirations of the Palestinian people and the appalling attacks there. And they won seats in Parliament, in the British Parliament, only 2 months ago. My view is that Labour, in order to keep together their coalition, are trying now to appeal to people who are very, very sceptical of Israel's motives and actions in Gaza.
I think it is interesting going back to that point in the conversation that we had earlier about the UK standing in the world, because it can't be isolated anymore. It can't be, and never has it ever. It's always been a trading hub and an international hub, but increasingly globalized world, increasingly you see these types of conflicts affecting things like elections in the UK and the US, amongst other things. So that's why I'm interested to know, what are you planning to do now, post-parliamentary career? Are you thinking of more international career for
Well, lots of things. Yeah, lots of things. I mean, I've always had an international interest. When I was in Parliament, I was vice chairman of something called the Conservative Middle East Council as a backbencher. I travelled as a minister to the United States, to the Gulf, a number of other places. My own family background is West African. Those of you who know West Africa will know that Kwasi is a very common name. It doesn't mean born on a Sunday, but it's a name given to males born on a Sunday, that sort of thing. And so my background and my interests, I've written about empire in the past. My interests are very much international focused. Obviously, I'm a great British patriot. I love my country, but I'm also interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. And I suspect going forward, I will be engaged more internationally. Because as an MP, you can't just travel willy-nilly to other parts of the world. You know, you've got to be there you've got to be in Westminster for parliamentary votes. You've obviously got to look after the needs and of your constituents. So you're very much rooted in the UK. I think having left the British Parliament, I think the international dimension becomes more interesting and accessible.
Certainly, you've got the freedom to roam now. Look, Kwasi Kwarteng, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to you. Thank you.
That is all we've got time for on Global News today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews and debate. Until then, good night.